All the best.
Rishabh, please take the as all the best.
Hi, Parth, all the best. Please respect my opinion.
I'm not on mansplaining debating with Mr. Dinos in the house. Please be respectful. Highly increasing yours in fact. Very excited to start this debate. With that, PM and Great.
Shoutouts. First to my mother, for whom I started debating. Then to 20 episodes, obviously. Mahesh, Abdul, I wanted to team up with Mahesh since I was my first year. He judged our first mock with the president. And Abdul, first teammate, great friend, always pleasure. Okay. With that.
If any fonts, like please ensure all fonts are inside. Please don't disclose.
Okay. Starting speech. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm just going to answer 2 questions in this speech. 1, what does the process of reaching this realization look like? Second, why is it your responsibility to begin with? First, on what does this process look like? So I want all of you to imagine a world when we come onto Earth. So you are born as a baby and there's some sort of ideas that get fed to you. By your parents first. This is right, that is wrong. Then you enter prep school and then your nursery teachers teach you the alphabet. So if you're going into different schools, you get exposed to different ideas. Your surroundings tell you different things. The difference between good touch and bad touch and stuff like that, that gets propagated as a result of everything that's getting told to you by your surroundings, which ends up being your base reality. So all of us end up starting off with a moral base that is established for all of us. That's the first step. What's the second step of reaching this moral realization? It's when you find yourself at crossroads, which is to say, whatever you knew before this, suddenly it does not make sense. Which means whatever your base reality was, you need to break free of that barrier in order for you to get exposed to newer ideas. Which means you are at a fork, when you start getting persuaded by different ideas. The intuition pump here is simple. So, I could be pro-abortion, let's just say, because I am engaging in material that Mac Walsh and Ben Shapiro are talking about. But the point in time, for example, I end up watching a YouTube video that's talking about why this is not the best thing, and then there are certain claims that I found in some YouTubers, Alex O'Connor for that matter, I don't care. And then I feel that, oh, you know what, this probably makes sense as well, which means this is the second step, wherein I am in a split about whether or not what my previous thinking about my base reality was is correct or not, which means I'm getting persuaded by these ideas. I want you to note there are external factors that are involved here. So this only happened when I chose to break free of that base reality and when other interventions started coming in. The third step to this process is bad visual consequences of these actions, which means unexpected outcome. So for example, if I live in a community where I feel slapping women is the right thing to do and everybody does that, and I feel like that's good, but I fall in love with this beautiful woman, and all of a sudden I don't want to slap her anymore. But I do it anyway because I feel it is right. But when I do, she ends up crying and I don't feel nice about that. And as a result of that, I start questioning whatever it is that I was thinking in the first place. But a better intuition pump here is, for example, I'm a US soldier. So I think it is my obligation, so it's like nationalist and like very patriotic of me to go ahead and represent my country in Iraq or Syria. But the point in time I enter, I see a lot of people are getting killed. I see other actors are entering there, and as a result of that, multiple people are dying as a result of this. Now this is not something I had in mind when I wanted to pursue my patriotism in the first place, which means this is a bad visual consequence of whatever my base reality was. So the fork and the persuasion that happens led to a bad visual consequence, as a result of which I ended up questioning what this realization was in the first place. The fourth way this happens is that this is a long drawn process, which means this probably happens transgenerationally, which means there's a lot of introspection that need to get done. Why is this true? Because the cultures that you surround yourself with often end up imposing the same ideas onto you again and again. So for example, if honor killings are normalized, I for a long time am just going to assume that honor killings are like justified. So if I'm like living in, I don't know, fairyland where all of this is justified, the point in which I expose myself to different ideas, which is only when this process starts to actualize and this act ends up acting as inoculum, is when this entire debate pans out. Which means this is a long drawn process to begin with. Before that,
Yeah, at some point about all these experiences, you will decide that this is your morality, and then you start to act on it, right? Because obviously that can't keep on shifting as soon as you take an action, because if your morality suddenly switch, you can't just switch the action that you've already taken. So you has to be consistent at some point of your life. What is that point?
okay, moving on. Why is it your responsibility to begin with? I think three things. I think it's your responsibility because one, there's a principle of reparation that we want to run, that you owe this to people that you're involved in. Second, on power, and like you have the power to do this in the first place, and that's it. So first, let's talk about reparation and how this pans out. So as the POI talked about, so there are probably like different moral codes that have existed thus far. So X community tells you to do something, Y community tells you to do something. So this is on a spectrum, and these moral codes are subjective to begin with. So there are different circumstances that people have, different religions, different backgrounds, different schools of teachings that you come from. But the issue is this: we as a human society have evolved only through the interaction of these different ideas over time, which means it's when these different interactions took place with each other, and in the Venn diagram of things there were different intersections at that point in time, that we ended up evolving as a species, which means these different like moralities, when they interacted and were more likely like contradictory in nature and ended up hurting certain communities or hurting someone at that point in time, it's only then that this evolution took place, which is why the principle of reparation unlocks. And I want to be very clear about this. So I owe it to the person whose moral code is different than me for me to act on that realization. I'm not taking that. That is why it is my responsibility. For example, if it's my moral code that I just need to cut my hand or I need to drive my car into the tree, that's fine. That only impacts me. But go back to the process of reaching that moral realization in the first place. The point in time there are other people that were involved in that process. That is the point. It becomes a responsibility. So here's the like just the TLDR of our case. We think we owe it to the person whose moral code is different than ours for us to not pursue it in the longer run, precisely because it's just not me who is involved in this, it's also the other person that's being impacted by this as a result of this. Which means the way we've evolved over time has been through the interaction of these different ideas, schools of thought, like Islam telling you something, Hinduism telling you something, maybe not thinking the same way, communal violence, etc. And that is how the evolution has taken place. Second, on simply capacity of power, we think with great power comes great realization, because there are a lot of dependents that are dependent on you and you owe it to them to act on that moral responsibility in the first place. We are able to prove two things in this speech. The way this process looks like is not independent, which means there are other people that are getting involved. So, trigger warning, if I decide to do suicide at some point in time, that's fine, only impacts me. The point in time it becomes a responsibility is when there are other people involved in it, and when I owe it to them, then it becomes a responsibility. Propose.
shout out to the detailed episode obviously. All my seniors who always helped me and kept me guided. Starting in starting in 3, 2.
Take some just
I think he's got to one.
Let's start with Pratha's same example. She tells me that if you live in a society where slapping a woman is right, but I suddenly fall in love, on their side of the paradigm, I have the responsibility of going ahead and slapping that woman and probably bearing the consequences of that. On our side of the paradigm, what is likely to happen is that you rationally find out whether that is the right action to take or the wrong action to take. But secondly, you also have an involvement of significant amount of emotions, whether, oh, I've fallen in love with her and this is not the right thing to do. On their side of the paradigm, you are forced to do that. On our side of the paradigm, you take a much realistic approach of whether you should do that, whether you should not. Secondly, they tell me that you're likely to go ahead and see a right-wing video, but on the other day, you're probably likely to go ahead and consume a left-wing video. That is highly unlikely to happen because A, people around me are largely similar in nature. People around me have similar beliefs. That is also their framing. But secondly, at the point in time I go ahead and view a right-wing video, I'm probably biased towards that particular thing because of the simple logic of priority. Of coming ahead. But secondly, you don't have the incentive to go ahead and watch another video that is probably leftist in nature. I don't understand why you have incentive to go ahead and buy both sides of the paradigm. But secondly, at the point in time there's different environments with respect to me, and there's a large amount of different changing surroundings which might change how I probably morally realize, or how that probably largely affects my moral realization. I have two framings on that. Number one, moral realization later is likely to resort largely on your family and religion because of two characterizations further. Number one, that is the most proximate thing to you. But secondly, that happens at a very young age. At a point in time I interact with my family for a huge amount of time at a very young age. Those are the things that are largely likely to get embedded in me. But secondly, I'm likely to be very fixed onto them, which means these ideas are likely to be very fixed and embedded into me, which means I'm less open to more and more ideas. But secondly, if I'm a conservative and who probably thinks that women should not go to work and stay at home, I am morally told to believe that this is the right path to take, irrespective of whether that is objectively right or objectively wrong. Which means ethical implications of your actions are determined by your morals and environment, and that is what they have to determine. That is what they have to defend. Because this is explicitly mentioned in the context side, but secondly, this is not dependent on law. But lastly, this is also decided by echo chambers who do not necessarily care about others. Which means the people around me significantly have a similar view and do not care about others and like to go ahead and take the same action. Which means a family of a thief probably feels theft is good because you're serving for your family, but that is not the objective good that happens on their side of the paradigm. But lastly, how is internalization of responsibility likely to happen? Three framings under that. Number one, this is largely personal to you, which means you need to take an action. At the point in time, you have a responsibility of taking an action onto something that you've spent a significant amount of time. I don't understand why you have to go ahead and take a large amount of people's opinions on that. Their framing is that at a point in time, you have a responsibility to do X thing, you probably involve a large amount of people into that. I don't understand why that is true for two reasons. Number one, at the point in time you are having this moral realization, you are likely to have thought that process out for a long amount of time. Which means at a point in time I am spending significant amount of time thinking about the same thing. I don't understand why I go ahead and doubt that thing and take another person's opinion onto that, whether that is right or whether that is wrong. Which proceeds by further fact that you are not willing to take advice. You're not going to take advice because you probably think that is irrelevant in nature. Because simply understand, I spent a complete day thinking about it, and then I go to my friend who probably tells me that is redundant. That is not your responsibility to act on your moral realization. The responsibility to act on my moral realization is that I spent a day thinking about X, and the next day I probably have to act on that because that is my responsibility. Because the responsibility says that you have not just the incentive, but also you need to have the capacity to go ahead and carry out that action. But third, this burdens you. Which means now that I have the responsibility to go ahead and act on my moral realization, I'm burdened to go ahead and fulfill my capacity of that, irrespective of whether that is probably objectively good or whether I necessarily feel good about that implicitly or probably emotionally. Which means this is a direct implication to their case. If there is no responsibility, there is no binding act that you need to go ahead and take this action. I've already framed out to you why necessarily this action is not likely to be be objectively good or objectively bad. Clarification.
So if you've grown with your family and religion since day one, you can't have a realization while being in that echo chamber. That realization occurs when you get exposed to different ideas, and the motion gives us the fiat to do that.
No, I don't think you only have the realization when you're exposed to a completely different idea. I can probably be exposed to a completely different environment, which is why I have probably a realization of that particular action. Which means at a point in time I'm probably raised in a family who probably supports going to protests. At a point in time I view different things that are happening, or probably suddenly I feel something is bad, I probably feel protesting against it is the right way to go about it. But moving on, I'll tell you why echo chambers are likely to form on their side of the paradigm, and even if they're symmetric in nature, that is much worse on their side of the paradigm. At the point in time, people who think similar form echo chambers. That is simple. That happens on both sides of the paradigm. But secondly, when you're significantly involved with your own thought process, when you probably spend significant amount of time thinking about something, you don't want to take others' advices. But secondly, you also act on it because it is your responsibility. On a comparative, even if echo chambers exist, you don't need to take actions. How does this look like? At the point in time, I'm a part of the majority who probably thinks minorities are bad. At the point in time that is true, what is the best thing I do on our side of the paradigm? I probably talk about it, but I don't take significant amounts of action. At a point in time, on their side of the paradigm, you have the responsibility, and mention the context slide also says this. You want to fulfill your responsibility to the best possible way you can. Which means at a point in time, I've decided that minorities are bad in nature, I have to significantly go ahead and take actions against them, because that is what fulfills my responsibility, that is what fulfills my best capacity to probably go ahead and probably take physical action against them. Which means, the bottom line of this is that minority suppression is likely to increase significantly on their side of the paradigm, because majorities don't just form echo chambers, but they're also likely to go ahead and take action. But secondly, it is tough to break echo chambers, because when you think it is your responsibility to go ahead and act on something you've thought significantly, you don't probably go ahead and talk to people outside that echo chamber. But secondly, there's also significant amount of regret present on their side of the paradigm. Pratha tells you that if a person I love is someone who I morally think I should slap, there's significant amount of regret attached with that, because that person is likely to go ahead and leave me at that point in time. This is a regret that is attached with it, which means you have to significantly bear with the consequences of probably carrying out that act in the very first case. That is binding on their side of the paradigm, because that is responsibility. But if that is not carried out on their side of the paradigm, and you probably go ahead and ask people and probably think, oh, this is not the right thing to do, then that is not your responsibility to act onto it. The responsibility to act onto it is exactly what they have to defend, which I think they have not yet done. But secondly, a large, you sure can control your own capacity, but you can't necessarily control your environment. Which means you can't control public, you can't control law, you can't control environment. Which means if I go ahead and donate to charity, but the charity is corrupt, I can't take a positive action. If I want to protest, but there are now not a large amount of people who are there to support me, I can't probably feel good about it. Which means actualizations of my moral realization is significantly tougher on their side of the paradigm. But if it is my responsibility, I'm likely to feel much worse on their side of the paradigm than you are likely to feel bad on our side of the paradigm. Which is why even if there's no responsibility on the comparative, you're better.
Alright, a few shout-outs from my end as well. First to my teammates, Pratha and Mahesh. I think it's a long time since the 19th. Secondly, to a bunch of our juniors who were not able to break in the tournament and felt really sad, but I think they did a great job and they are very good debaters. So shout out to Isha and also to Prashant and everyone else in the circuit who helped me grow. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I want to clarify a bunch of things because I think the conceptualization of this motion is very off. The first thing I want to conceptualize is how does the process of moral realization occur? If throughout your life you've grown with your family, you've grown with your religion, you've grown in this bubble which has made your default chamber of morality, the only way a fork occurs, the only way a realization occurs, the only way a change occurs is when you get outside of the bubble. That is how this debate operates. The motion says that you've already gone through this process of moral realization and you've got into it, which means you've already gone out of this bubble and consumed a different set of ideology that we frame in first, which defines your belief. This takes out their frame in the first place to begin with. Which means on our side of the house, echo chambers and the argument that they derive from this frame is absolutely irrelevant. Because on our side, if this is a pragmatic debate where moral realization becomes a trend, I think there's a cascading effect to stop echo chambers. If anything, there's higher incentive to go ahead and interact amongst different people so that you can go ahead and have more moral realizations. So discussions between people who are pro-Palestine and pro-Israel increase on our side of the house because you want to challenge your moral codes and you want to change your moral beliefs. So if anything, the echo chambers exist on their side of the house on the comparative when moral realization is not a trend, while on our side of the house when it becomes something, if they want to argue pragmatics, then on our side of the house you have less echo chambers. So that's the first thing that I want to deal with. The second clarification that I want to have is with regards to harms that they put on us. They say that people are going to regret and people are going to be burdened. This is not their burden. They have to explain why this proves that there's no responsibility. Even if people are burdened and regret and they have regret, we don't care. It is still their responsibility. That's an irrelevant harm that they're pushing into. The final thing that I want to do is deal with this argument of bad actions. They say that people might take bad actions. But let's just say your moral realization is that you should kill someone. What happens then? I think first of all this is uncomparative because people take actions which are bad regardless or based on their moral code. The reason they do this is because societal structures which propagate moral codes necessarily want to go ahead and inflate the value of their moral codes. That is to say that you necessarily want to portray your moral code as the best so that you can get the highest amount of buy-in from people into your moral code. So if anything, insofar we exist in a world where moral codes are exaggerated with respect to how much value they hold, people take actions on their moral codes regardless, which means that moral codes are bad actions are uncomparative and symmetric. This is the negative part of the speech. Let's start with the positive part. I think the first thing that we explain is reparation. I just want to clarify this because they don't engage me. Note that in a world in which you act on your moral action and you have a specific realization post that, the consequence of your moral code is not just generally limited to you. Because human beings are interdependent. So when as a US soldier you go into Iraq and your moral code is that I need to liberate this country and you end up creating a power vacuum which hurts people, the consequence of your moral code is not just restricted to you, it's restricted to the people of Iraq who get killed. Which means there's a reparation that you owe to them which defines your responsibility. So now if your moral code is to go ahead and make people aware about how the US ended up committing like 56 interventions out of which only 2 succeeded, you act on that responsibility. You go ahead and talk about the fact that this is something which is not working out, this is something which should not happen in South Sudan in the future. These are the sort of things that happen on our side of the house. No, not right now. But secondly, this reparation argument is critical because of the framing of how humanity has developed. And I want you to conceptualize this. In a world in which we live, in which everybody is dependent on each other, everybody thinks that their moral code is perfect. The reason why they do this is because every societal structure which propagates a moral code want to inflate their values as I specifically explained. Which also means that the vast majority of these moral codes are contradictory to each other. That is to say that one moral code will make you do X, the other moral code will make you do Y, which is complete opposite of X. This is why once this contradiction occurs, you end up creating harms and benefits, which creates an interdependence. So maybe my moral code tells you to harm you, your moral code tells me to harm me, which ends up happening in such a way that I owe an obligation to you and you owe an obligation to me. All of this explains that once this moral realization occurs to us, that this is not the moral code on which we should operate. It is our responsibility to act on it because we owe it to each other. This is the first metric on the basis of which reparation is justified. This is what Pratha explains. They don't engage. But extension then, cost. I'm going to talk about the second metric on the basis of which responsibility is justified. Note that human beings have not existed on their own as we specifically frame, which means they work together, they build communities. So your ability to act on a moral code is not something that you can do on your own. It's generally something which happens when somebody inputs a certain amount of cost into it. So if my moral code tells me that I should debate and it's a good thing, I can't can't debate on my own. I need Angad's help to help me debate this, which means if I put 100 hours into debating, it's not just my hours, it's Angad's hours of training me as well. Which means if human beings in general have selfish incentives, that is to say, that once you act on a moral code and you reach a certain point, and now you think this moral code is harming you, and if your incentive is to prioritize yourself, the reason why you can't do that is specifically because there's an external cost which is involved. The cost that Angad had. Yeah, sure.
How do you define your ethicality?
I mean, this is very subjective. Ethicality can be defined according to different people, according to their own preferences. I don't know what you want me to answer within this claim. Yeah, finally, I just want to be clear with the cost claim again. Insofar as human beings have selfish incentives to prioritize themselves, they have to act, and insofar as they pursue these moral codes and end up prioritizing themselves, once the realization occurs that you should not have done it, they have an obligation to act on that responsibility because an external cost is involved. So if I want to quit debating because I am selfish and I want to prioritize my own career, and later down the line I have a moral realization that I should not have done that, I have a responsibility to act on it because Angad invested his time in making me become a better debater. So there's an external cost that is involved, and therefore that's the second metric on the basis of which you define responsibility. Till now they have no material on how you define responsibility on their side of the house. That's the call out of the question. Third, cascading effect. I want to talk about the second layer of extension now. The second layer of extension is this. The issue is that this responsibility does not exist, and they want to debate about pragmatics. Human beings in general always make the easier choices. It is always easy to procrastinate. It is always easy to sleep. It is always easy to not go ahead and do whatever you want to do and achieve your goals. Which means it's always easy to not do the thing which is going to hurt you. Which means if anything on our side of the house, on their side of the house, if this responsibility does not exist, the issue is that nobody ever acts on their moral realization. So on their side, there's no kick-starting of a process where people correct themselves. It is only on our side of the house that there's a cascading effect which becomes as a result of this narrative being popular and this responsibility being enacted. All of this explains why the metric on the basis of which you judge this debate is, first of all, why there's responsibility on our side. The final thing that I want to do is just weigh a little bit of stuff. The first thing that I would note is that cost that people have is something which cannot be changed. So it's a permanent cost. This impacts the argument and the metric of cost in the first place. So if Angad has invested 500 hours in training me and I don't want to debate anymore, I owe an obligation to act on my moral realization because that cost cannot be changed. It's already gone. It's a permanent thing which won't ever be changed in the future. Since it has happened, therefore it's something which matters. This proves why the second metric of cost which I extend on is important. Mahesh will be the first metric of interdependence on how it's the only thing which human beings have buy-in into. I think for all of those reasons, there's a clear government.
Right, shout outs to Include EPSOC and also Include EPSOC. It's very solid debaters. Also, yeah, I was in the same podium 2 years ago. I'm not here after 2 years. So, starting in 3, 2, 1. Read the context slide. It says you judge or you act on the basis of an ethical consideration that you have. How does your ethics get decided? And this is just a fancy way to say morality, honestly. Because ethics and the ethical implications of your actions are also gauged by the barometer of your own morality. Which means that if you believe that something is right, there's no universal ethics code that forces you to believe that it's wrong. Which means that if you slap a woman and you feel that it's your morality because you saw your father do it, you saw your elder brother do it, and their eyes were crying, but it was okay because you went ahead and got those things normalized inside your head, and that formed the foundation of your morality. Your ethics will not pull you out of it because ethics are gauged based by morality in the first place and not something that's universally subscribed to by all individuals. The fundamental assumption and mistake they make in this debate is that they assume that there's an objectively right and bad or good or bad that exists in this world, and you use that as an everyone breaks out of the echo chambers, because the kind of exposure you have is depend on your financial, social and cultural phenomena around you, the environment around you. What if my YouTube algorithm doesn't show that left-wing video? What if I don't get exposed to those ideas? I think the problem on their side becomes that you get bogged down by this responsibility so much that you have to act on it. And this is where I want to draw the comparative in this debate. On our side of the house, the burden is just to explain that we do not have the responsibility to act. That means you can still have the moralization on our side of the house, but you don't have to act on it necessarily. Responsibility, by definition, means there's an obligation on you, and an overarching obligation on just yourself to act on this information and act on this moralization to the best possible extent. There are three things that this obligation does for you which is bad. One, it makes a huge opportunity cost in your life. Why? Because if you, for example, if me as I am a majority want to oppress a minority, I probably don't want to give them rights, or maybe like it's like a house help in my home, right? And I want to just abuse them because I feel like and I believe that I am morally superior to them, or I am a higher person than them in terms of caste or religion or whatever the fuck you want to go ahead and subscribe yourself. When you go ahead and do that, the problem becomes that you have ethical implications which tell you to do this, right? Because you believe that this is ethically right thing to do, considering it's also shaped by your own morality. But practically it's bad, because when you abuse the house help, they will probably not come to work. But the counter side says that you can just judge the action by its ethical implications. And this becomes a problem, that when you act on the ethical implications and you disregard the practical implications, you don't have a counterbalancing force on their side of the house. Which means you act on this information and you don't care whether your utensils will get washed or the food will be prepared in your house at that point. You just want to ensure that you're doing this particular action in the best ethical way that you believe is ethical. That means it's a huge opportunity cost that you have to incur. Secondly, it's called a massive amounts of regret. They say regret doesn't matter if you're a responsibility. I think regret amplifies itself when you have a responsibility towards something. Imagine for a second that I give you responsibility to teach your younger brother maths and the child failed. What happens? You feel so much shitty because you believe that you have a responsibility to do it better. This is the biggest issue. Responsibility forces people to do this in the perfect manner possible. This means that when you don't do it perfectly, or even if it's a one notch lower, you always have that regret that I could have chosen to control the surroundings in the manner that I wanted to, but I couldn't, and that becomes the problem. Hridhik tells you from first speech onwards that implications of your actions are not something that are completely in your control, because the environment is something that you can't control. Considering like what if the paper was too tough and you didn't teach him enough? That means those things are not in your control, but you still feel bad that I could have done more. This constant recollection of the regret that you have is what goes and compounds in things like guilt and bad mental health around much of time. Thirdly, every responsibility that you're given as a person, whether you're a child, whether your brother or your spouse, you always want to ensure that you do it to the maximum possible extent. This is what the context also says, that you do it to the highest possible extent that you can. Which means, I'm not just going to like abuse my house help, I'm also going to pay them less. So because I want to ensure that my responsibility is fulfilled to the best way possible, because only then I will feel responsible as an adult to go ahead and maximize the kind of morality that I have within me. I want to again be very clear on the comparative. On our side, you still have moralizations, but the ability to act on this, or the obligation to act on this is not on you. Which means you can choose to act on it based on practical implications, or your ability to engage with other narratives whatsoever. If the responsibility to act is not on you, which means you leave that space out for yourself to engage in counter narratives. Even if they are not present, at least you don't act on those instances in the worst possible manner, because the obligation forces you to act in the worst possible manner. That's the hump that we're dealing with now at government. Who would I go ahead to you?
Why do anti-Semitic people not go ahead and propagate hate against Israel on their side of the house, insofar as they believe in their moral code? Your argument is uncomparative because people can be bad on your side as well.
Yeah, people can be bad, but they're not forced to act on that bad nature. That's the point, right? When you force people to act on bad nature, on scale you are harming everyone, because you have to constantly keep on acting on it. It becomes a moral impetus or responsibility and obligation on you to act. On our side, the responsibility is not there, and that's the burden we are taking. We're just saying they don't have the obligation, responsibility to act on it. You can choose to still have it. You might hate Palestinian people inside your hearts, but should you go ahead and start funding Israel? That is what vote change on our side of the house. Those are small incremental changes that majorities should be forced to make on our side of the house. Now, why is that the case? Probably they care about things like image. Probably maybe a person who hates Palestine people will not act on this particular manner because they know that this can cause bad negative PR for themselves. But they don't care about those negative PR on their side, because they just care about the ethicality of it and not the practical outcome of it. Which means there's no counterbalancing force that exists which stops you from own acting or your own ethicality. This is the biggest issue that they have. They assume everyone has access to information, which is obviously good and positive. I would note that people who are born in liberal households get exposed to conservative ideas also and can get to that echo chamber also. I don't understand why it's always a negative to positive growth cycle. It can be the other way around as well, which means people can go ahead and get certified or organized in conservative ideas also, which means when they become an adult and when they have the moralization, which probably happens when you are like an adult and in 25, 30 and you realize that okay, this is what life means for me. At that point, you can be a hardcore right-wing conservative and you can still start hating people. I don't understand then why dynamics of morality keeps on changing on left side of the house. It might not change on our side, but those incremental benefit that we claim is something that we will not.
Let's go, Rishabh! Am I audible? Shout out to Hridhik. I know his shoulders are bad. Shout out to DQ Desktop and my junior sitting there. Good job. Starting in 3, 2, 1. If bad people can do bad things on both sides of the house, good people can also do good things on both sides of the house. Because it takes similar effort to fund Palestine and it takes similar effort to fund Israel. The debate then is about people who probably do not want to act and are forced to act on their side of the house because of the responsibility impetus that is put onto them. The first thing I want to weigh is how does the process look like, because I think that in of itself is debate winning. The second thing I'll just weigh is why this is not the responsibility, because Gupta drops it, so you can say that it is not important in the debate anyway. But the third thing I want to weigh just is regret. First, how does the process look like? Their claim is to say that the process includes various different interactions and that's why the impact of this is going to be good. The first thing with this is they assume you make the effort to find different views to begin with. If you want to find different things, they do not come to you by yourself. They say that, oh, you go to a college and join a DevSoc, but it takes efforts to join a DevSoc also. It takes efforts to join a liberal college also, which you probably do not want to make because you think what your parents and religion telling you is correct to begin with. But second, they assume that you allow those other views to also be part of introspection. So probably Angad can tell me a bunch of other things that I do not believe. What their burden is to approve is that I also internalize what he is telling me and internalize it in myself. So even if you are exposed, it does not mean you internalize it and bring it into your personal introspection, which the info slide talks about. Why it is going to be unlikely? 3 reasons. First, you just cannot take a risk of someone else's moral obligation harping over your moral obligation, because the consequences of the action that you are going to take will be on you only. So you will get the blame only and you do not want that risk at any point of time. But you want the whole control over the action you are taking. So if it is good also, you also want the good whatever praise you get in return also only for you and not to be divided. And that's why you do not want this to be divided in different amount of people and you do not want them to impede on you. But second, others also do not want to advise you, because they also think that if they advise you and you take a bad action, they'll be part of the blame, which they do not want to take additionally if they're already personally introspecting themselves. At a point of time, there is some opportunity cost, but also efforts to go ahead and influence you and tell you what the moral code is. I do not think people take it on their side of the house because of this threshold that they have to cross. But third, they assume the capacity for individuals to do it in the best way also. Because if DTM concedes people are lazy, I think that also means that people are lazy to understand that liberal video and also include it into that intersection, because they do not want to do so because they have already a moral code formed. So I just do not know what is the impetus if people are already lazy, which is a concession from them. The bottom line of this is on both sides of the house you form echo chambers with different moral codes, which again is a concession at DPM. So you will judge this debate further there. The delta is what you do with this realization. On their side of the house, there is only one thing you can do. act. On our side of the house, there are two things you can do. Either you do not act, or either you act but in not the largest capacity, because the last line of the context line says that you have to act to the fair extent that you think you can. So you want to fulfill the responsibility as much as you can, so you can get the maximum praise from that consequence that you are doing. What they have to defend is then by a blanket policy of always acting on everything you believe is going to be true. On our side now, you can choose to act, you can choose not to act, or you can choose to act in some manner. So if anti-Semites are going to act on both sides of the house in bad ways, on their side of the house they are forced to go to Israel and kill Palestinians because they think that that is what the extent they have. On our side of the house, at best they do is fun because people are lazy according to their own framing. On their side of the house, they push people to do bad things to the worst extent, and that is the problem there. The second thing I want to tell is that on our side of the house there is a stopgap. So you do a moral realization on both sides of the house, you come to an action that I want to take this action. Now since action is a threshold, because you know after doing that action it would be irreversible whatever you do, now you want to do realization as to whether should I take this action or not. On their side of the house you do not do this because there is already responsibility to act. So there is no question whether should I act or should I not act. On our side of the house there is some question whether you should act or not act, or in what capacity you should act. This is the impetus that forces you to interact with other moral codes, because now you do not want immediate backlash on you or immediate praise on you, because you have some stopgap, some capacity to rationalize what your action is going to be, so you probably get better actions than on our side of the house. I think this being is enough to do why you probably get better actions and better consequences on our side of the house. Because probably if I have 50 rupees in my wallet and if I want to buy chips, on their side of the house you are told that you have to spend all 50 rupees to buy those chips, even if you probably do not need those chips to feed yourself. On our side of the house I can just spend 10 rupees, so just on bad actions also the delta is less. Therefore, second, on responsibility, which they brought. First, the only claim as to why you are responsible for it is to say that there is some cost behind me. But this assumes that the cost is monolithic. So if Angad tells Abdul that he needs to debate, Abdul's mother has also told him that he needs to study. That means he has to choose between two costs, whether he goes with Angad's obligation or whether he goes with his mother's obligation. So there are different obligations and different responsibilities that are pushed onto me. It doesn't mean that I prefer one responsibility over the other and I act on that responsibility. But second, this is not an inherent responsibility. If cost is the mechanism, this is a responsibility pushed onto you and it's not a good thing. So if Angad tells me to kill someone, does not mean I have always to act on it, and it's a moral obligation on me to begin with. This is the burden that I had to do as to why this is a responsibility in vacuum. The third thing that I want to do is just weigh on regret, because this is what makes us win this debate in the second way. The first thing under this is probably actions are still going to be speculative, because they say at the end that moral codes work, moral codes change, moral codes probably develop, probably regress anyways. So probably your actions change, probably Israel becomes the superpower in future, probably Palestine becomes the important thing that Americans care about. So it's always going to be some sort of arbitrariness or some sort of speculation. The only thing that is certain is what you want to achieve from that consequence is not going to be ideal, because there are always going to be arbitrary factors. That is a certain thing. Why this is bad and causes you regret before that?
When there is no responsibility on their side of the house, why do bad people who have selfish incentives don't take bad actions? Do you have
they take bad actions. You're not listening to the speech. The extent of the action they take and why this is going to be the worst is what you need to prove. They do this on our side of the house. But second, they do not take this bad action now because they have a stopgap to realize I have a choice to not take this action or to take this action. On your side of the house, they do not have this choice and always have to take this action to begin with. Then on regret. Since this is certain that you are not going to get the best benefit out of what you have conceived or whatever you have imagined, probably you are going to always think that this is not what I wanted. So even if I studied 5 days to get 100 in my maths exam and I think I deserve 100 marks, but I got 80, that's still a good outcome. But that is not the outcome I wanted. So that means I'm still going to regret because I put a lot of effort into it, I introspected a lot, and for a long amount of time, a huge opportunity cost that I invested in it, and I'm still not getting what I really wanted. What happens then? You are sad. You are probably you regret whatever you did in past, and you're more likely to not take any decisions in future because you think that whatever you do in future is still going to fail, and you're always going to get that backlash and always going to get regret. So if they think that taking action is good, probably in long term you get more actions instead on our side of the house, where people probably interact and take good actions, but also have impetus to take good actions because they do not have the pressure to make this action as best as possible. They're fine with those 80 marks, and probably you get more good things on our side of the house because of this.
Right, starting. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 2 clashes, 1 minorities, vulnerable people, secondly on regret. I think the most pernicious harm of this debate happens on minorities and vulnerable people because they are obviously the most vulnerable, and secondly they are largest on scale. I would want to note, and this is the shady way they have. They say it's a wash because bad people are bad people anyway. But that symmetrical logic applies to good people who are going to be good people anyway. They don't need that extra push. I would want to note, and this is the case they build for us, that people who are supposed to act on the kind of ethicality that they believe is right or wrong have 2 stopgaps on our side of the house. And that is what changes the way people do bad actions, mostly because the harm exists more on the fact that you are going to go and oppress minorities. The first is the practical implication that they explained to you, that you want to see beyond ethical implications, because the ethics is something that you determine by yourself, which means it's not contingent on external factors or practicality, that the kind of image that you have, or the kind of the people ask you to go and stop, because ethics come from within you. So if you're just looking at the ethical implications, the context side says that you just have to look for ethical implications, then you don't go ahead and consider pay heed to practical implications that are something that doesn't stop you from acting on the worst kind of excesses that humans have. Second, they say people are lazy. This is literally a stopgap, right? That means people don't always act on our side of the house, which means if people have bad intentions on our side, they don't obviously manifest in the worst possible manner on our side because people are lazy by their own concession. So I don't necessarily need to know why people on our side are always going to act the same manner and why this argument is a wash, because it's not a wash because you just say it's symmetric, but to prove that it's a wash and not just assert it. Cool. They say that the threshold to do good is something that's higher, so you need a push. Whereas the threshold to do bad is lower, that means you don't need a push, people do it anyway. The problem is, if I have to go ahead and give out like $1 million to charity, as an Israeli, I can either go ahead and fund Palestinian NGOs, or I can separate in the war fund. Why are these two things different standards? Why does it require me to just go ahead and make a bank transfer on either side of the house? So they have to explain structurally why in most instances people don't do good because it's a higher threshold. I want Abdul to explain to me in where in the 3 speeches they have one mech to explain why doing good is something that requires extra effort, but doing bad is very easy for people. I would also go ahead and make a counterintuitive claim that going and oppressing individuals is also tough. It requires physical resources, or even financial resources. If you oppress and torture someone, it obviously requires effort. Similarly, helping someone cross the road also requires effort. Both require effort. The idea in this debate is that should you act on that particular responsibility. It's not about whether the effort is required more or not, but the idea is the harms that when you do negative are much more pernicious than the benefits that you do when you're pushed to do good on their side of the house. Second, on regret. And again, I want to use an intuition mark that has been running throughout the debate. Note that if you don't take the responsibility of teaching your brother maths and he fails, you will obviously offset the blame as per Mahesh to say that it was never my responsibility. It was the teacher's fault that they didn't teach him well enough. I was just helping out. Maybe it's not my fault he failed. But on their side, when the responsibility is on you, you cannot offset it. Because human beings always want to believe that they are the ones who fulfill the responsibility that's put on them by society or by principle or by the universe. Which means, if this portion on their side means that you have to go ahead and opt into this obligation, this means you're always faced with more regret when the actions do not play out the way you want it to play out. This is where they have to explain to us why everything is something that you can control, and the outcome of your actions is always something that always will be desirable for you, considering you can't control surroundings or why this particular action led to a negative consequence or whatever. Which means you regret much more on their side of the house, so winning on regret as well, but also the fact that we are winning on minorities, because at least on our side, we don't go and help minority in the best possible way. I'll agree that good people will also be lazy on our side, but the problem is the bad people will also be lazy, which means you don't extrapolate or accelerate the harm that you cause on minorities on our side, and that's the benefit you want to die on. We don't want to go ahead and consider the fact that people will just be pushed because they're getting pushed to do bad things. This is the second assumption they have. They believe that every individual always has a negative to positive arc. What if they have a positive to negative arc? What if they stay in their entire life in a negative scenario? What if they do not get exposed to the information that they want them to get exposed to? Then probably act on negative information and not positive information, which means you're going to create more harm in individuals. That is bad. We tell you that when you take responsibility, there's an opportunity cost. People don't want to help you out because it's your responsibility. You don't want others help because you want to feel in control, which means you want to push everyone out and act on that particular thing. We don't want an obligation to act against some people because that is the negative implication that happens to minorities for all those reasons.
Abdul, Rishabh, Bhai, PM, going in cover, starting in 3, 2, 1. There are a bunch of things that I want to clarify before I explain my view on a clear one. The first thing that I want you to know is the statement that individuals won't have capacity to get a moral realization because the echo chambers exist around you is outside of the ambit of this debate. Because if you have a responsibility to act on that moral realization, presumably that moral realization has already occurred. Only then you can act on it. So the burden they keep on pushing that you have to explain why you get a moral realization is not within the ambit, and that is why you don't prove it. It's an unfair burden to push. That's the first thing I would know. But you know what? They take up the burden to prove this. Because they say that they defend a world where people get moral realization and now they allow people to act on it and they have a choice to do this. If this is the burden, then their framing is unstrategic, because their framing is that echo chambers exist on both sides of the house. If that is the case, the motion gives us the fiat to assume that the responsibility exists and therefore the moral realization has happened. But it does not give them the fiat that the moral realization has occurred considering their own framing, which means they have to explain why moral realization happens on the first side on their side of the house. That's the first thing that I want to point out. But the second thing, and this is the metric on which you judge this debate, I think the question is, how do you determine responsibility? What are the factors on the basis of which you determine responsibility? First observation, individual harms don't matter. Maybe somebody is regretful, maybe somebody is going ahead and getting harmed, they still have to fulfill their responsibility. Maybe you have to care for your mother 24/7 and sacrifice your job that harms you, but it is still your responsibility because you owe something to your mother. So I don't care about individual harms as much as they happen. That's the first metric. The second metric that they have is utility. Let's deal with this first. Because they say that you have to check that bad people are going to do bad actions, because what if the arc in the change is good to bad? The first thing that we point out throughout this is that bad people on their side of the house will continue doing these actions all the time. They have two responses that they have on their side. The first response is that you have time to check your action. Why do you not have this time on our side of the house? When does this motion say that this responsibility should be implemented today, day after tomorrow? Why can't we go ahead and do this and implement this responsibility in a phased out manner? No explanation. So if people are lazy, they're lazy on both sides of the house and they won't go ahead and implement it instantly. So time gap is not a mechanism. Second, they say that on our side, you implement it to the fullest extent because the context slide says it, but on their side of the house, you don't. Why do people not go ahead and do bad actions if it benefits them? If Israel gets benefits out of killing people in Palestine, why won't it do it to the fullest extent to get the maximum value that it can derive? Is that ever explained on their side of the house? Which means bad actions and bad people committing all of this becomes symmetrical on both sides of the house because people do this. They say in reply that good people can also do good actions to the fullest extent. The issue is good actions come at a cost that we framed from the first speech itself. It comes at an individual cost that you have to go ahead and sacrifice something for the other person because you're trying to benefit the other person because human beings live in an interdependent world, which is the framing we run from first. That is why good actions in general don't allow. What is the metric on the basis of which you judge responsibility on government bench? This explains that utility does not matter. What matters then? First, we frame two specific things. First, the principle of reparation, then the principle of cost. I want to deal and talk about how they don't engage with reparation at all. We say that morality is subjective. This is the issue. What is even good and bad? Maybe the only way they win is if morality is an objective code. If something is explicitly bad, if something is explicitly good, only then the argument of bad actions and negative actions unlocked, only then the metric of utility unlocked. Insofar as morality is subjective, we frame that we live in a world which is interdependent and therefore the consequences of your moral code have actions on other people. That is to say that when you follow your moral code, there's something which harms the other person and therefore you owe an obligation to act on the realization which occurs in the future. So this is that sort of a debate where the realization happens later, the consequence of the moral code happens in the past. And once this happens, you have moral obligation to go ahead and do this because there's a principle of reparation that unlocks. If you go ahead, if your moral code tells you to smash yourself into a wall, maybe you don't act on it. You don't owe a responsibility to act on it, that this was a stupid decision. But once you go ahead and slap someone, you have an obligation because there's a reparation. They don't engage with it, that's a long-standing metric which is not. But second metric, cost. Rishabh says that cost is monolithic. I don't care. It's not monolithic. I don't care. Insofar as multiple people are involved, and when my phone occurs, there's a certain amount of cost which is involved, which means I have to owe something. For all of those reasons, this is